Hello. Today I wanted to show you just a couple examples of how real-life scenarios or some word problems can lend themselves really nicely to being solved by using a proportion. So, there's a handful of different situations that often suggest the use of proportions. If you see the word per in a problem, or if there's like a speed, miles per hour, or if there's a conversion where there's so many dollars per yen or something like that. A lot of times a simple proportion can be set up and solved to convert those things. We'll also talk about an example of parts and a whole, where you're talking about part of an object and then there's a bigger group and so forth. And percents lend themselves nicely to proportions as well. So first example is with a speed. If a car is traveling at 75 miles per hour, how long might it take to travel 500 miles? To set that up with a proportion, let me bring up my equation editor here. I'm going to write two different fractions, and I'm going to write in these fractions. In the first example, I'm going to use the 75 miles per hour, and I'll write that as a fraction, 75 miles per 1 hour. That 1 I had to add into that problem. But the other side of this equation, I'm going to put the 500 miles, which is what we know, and the thing that we don't know is how many hours that takes. So we can write x hours. And to be honest, when I set up the proportion, I usually don't write the units, miles and hours and miles and hours. I did it for now, so to show you how I set it up. And I just need to emphasize that when you set this proportion up, make sure that you're consistent. I have miles on top in both cases, and I've got hours on bottom in each cases. What I actually would write down on my paper would just be 75 over 1 equals 500 over x, and then that's a pretty easy one to solve. You would cross multiply 1 times 500 and 75 times x and solve that. For the interest of time, I'm not going to solve that for you now, but I wanted to show you how to set up the equation. So, another example where equations can be or a simple proportion can come up is when there's an idea of a part and a whole. Last year, I polled my class and I asked one of my hours how many of them would admit to bullying somebody at some point in their school careers. And 13 people were willing to admit that. I suspect more people have actually bullied but didn't want to raise their hand perhaps. And so in that class of 28, 13 said that they were bullies. And so the question is, how many students in our whole school of, say, 350 students, how many of them would be bullies? And so I'll set up a proportion again. And for these, I'm going to make sure that my proportions that I set up have the idea, the shape of a part on top and a whole on the bottom. So in my class, I had 13 people, that is part of the class, so I'm going to write that on top, that had admitted to being bullies, and 28 was the total number of students in my class. And then when I jumped to my entire school, I had, well, I don't know how many of them are bullies, so I'm going to call that X. And my entire school has 350 students in it, and so this would be the proportion I would set up. I probably wouldn't write parts and a whole on my paper. I probably would just write this: 13/28 is equal to x over 350, and that one's a little harder to solve because the numbers are bigger. You'd have to probably use a calculator to multiply them out, but again, you'd cross multiply. 13 times 350 equals 28 times x, and if you solve that one, I think it was about 160 students or so out of the 350 end up being potential bullies at some point. So the last example I wanted to show you real quick was a percentage. And so percents lend themselves to proportions really easily. The word percent, if you break it down, per is a ratio and cent is 100. And so percent, you often will write something over 100 as part of your proportion. So when I took my master's classes last year, I learned that if I were to give you or assign some appropriate reading material, some of those words ought to be new or challenging or unfamiliar words to you. And about 3% is kind of accepted as a decent amount. More than that, and it becomes too overwhelming, and less than that, and it's not challenging enough. And so if I were to give you a passage of 480 words to read, how many of those might be new or unfamiliar? Well, that sort of question can again be solved by setting up a proportion. So the proportion in this case, I'm going to kind of have that same parts and whole idea. The percent part of it, 3% is 3 is part of the whole, which is 100. And so 3% is written as 3/100ths. And then the other side, I don't know how many new or unfamiliar words I would expect, so I'll call that X. And the passage is 480 words long, and so I'd set up the whole is 480. And so I've got this proportion to solve. 3 times 480 is equal to 100 times X once you cross multiply. And again, for the sake of time, I won't solve that for you, but I think it was around 15 words or so. If you solve that, 15 out of those 480 are probably going to be new ones or key vocabulary words or something like that. Anyhow, that's solving a proportion, and I hope that you'll have opportunity to see situations where you can write a proportion in the future. Thanks for listening.